We've recently been putting out some new materials, the Brig, and we've got a welcome pack, and we were looking for something that would sum up what we hope it would be to experience Erskine Parish Church. And we came up with something around the ideas of to believe and also to belong. And that's because obviously a church should give you a vehicle for your faith and somewhere where your belief can be explored and hopefully strengthened. But also equally important is that sense of belonging, because that's something that none of us can live without. Something we all look for, either actively or passively, and something that we know when we found it because it actually makes our experience of life so much richer when we know we belong along with another group of people. And the scriptures are actually really concerned with that right from the opening. And the way they do that is by telling stories, particularly by using archetypes. If you want to get the definition of an archetype, it is quite hard to define. They're used in the first few chapters of Genesis, but if you've ever watched a movie, you know exactly what an archetype is, because they're full of them. If you're into what my oldest is obsessed with Star Wars, and so the archetypes I'm most familiar with are the ones in that, where Luke Skywalker is the hero, and the idea with an archetype is that you see yourself in the story, that you see him trying to overcome evil with good and performing heroic acts and working towards justice in the realm. And then you know that the likes of the little funny green guy, what's he called? Yoda, is a wise old sage. It's another archetype. It's something we aspire to, that hopefully as we get older, that we get wiser. And then, of course, there's what we want to avoid in the villain, whether it's Voldemort or Darth Vader. So all of those stories are meant to they're not meant to just be things about people out there and completely made up. They would have no power if we didn't somehow see ourselves within them, our hopes and our fears and so on. And all stories are constructed along those lines. And Genesis 1-3, I would argue to you, is no different. It's ultimately true and true at the most ultimate level. And it uses archetypes. If we go to the likes of Genesis 1 and we read it like a science textbook, then we're in real trouble. Because when these books are written, that's just going to completely do a disservice to what the authors are trying to get across, because they're not having a debate about creation versus evolution. They're talking about something actually much more important than that, the purpose for which you and I were made, and how we can find that within the story that God is unfolding. And so, how can I demonstrate that? Adam's name in Genesis 1-3, he's called Adam, the Hebrew word for man. And sometimes in Genesis that is used as, it's got the definite article, a man, the man, and sometimes it's just used as a name, and sometimes it's used as a kind of catch-all for all mankind, and it's the exact same word. So it's as though Genesis is trying to say, here is the man. Here is mankind, and here is someone that you're supposed to see yourself identified with. Same with Eve. It's answering the question of how can we continue to have this experience of life. Adam names her in Genesis 3 the mother of all living. What does that mean? We're all connected to her, and that means we're all connected to the story, and we're supposed to find ourselves in this story. And the writings of Genesis 1-3 don't emerge in a vacuum. They come in a world where all the cultures around the Hebrew people are writing their sacred texts about the origins of the world, about how everything came to be. And it's when you look at that background that this story becomes really interesting, because the contemporary Egyptian and Babylonian myths, they have a kind of panoply of deities fighting and warring in the heavens. They've got higher and lesser gods, and somehow out of the war and the struggle between them, I mean, I'm massively paraphrasing it, you get an earth and a heavens being created, and you get mankind being created. But they're massively subservient to the gods. And into that comes the Genesis story and its crowning dignity of mankind. And it's completely different from anything around it. And it's meant to teach us something important about God and how God relates to us. fundamentally, what I'm going to try and make a case for this morning is that it's about connection and community. That we are not, as I've titled this message, not alone. We're not alone because this shows us that in terms of where we come from, we're connected to God. That's why we feel connected to God or long for a sense of connection to God. We're also made for connection to one another, and we're also made for connection to our place, to our land, to our home. So connected to God, connected to each other, and connected to our home. Connected to God, the passage Callum read for us said in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. There are contemporary myths around when this is probably written, where the gods take some clay and they mingle it with some of the blood of the gods from above, and they somehow make mankind. And they make mankind for quite a special purpose, which is to do the drudge work of the gods. More importantly, some of the other ancient Mesopotamian myths show that mankind is made as a kind of general rabble, but kings and royalty are made in the image of God. It was normal for the gods at the time to create a temple and to spend a lot of time creating a temple. And then what they would do is finally place an image of themselves in the temple at the very end as the kind of crowning glory of the temple. And so over against all of that, you have this passage where it says that all of mankind, male and female, in equality, are made in the very image of God, the one who gives them life. That they are to bear something of his likeness in the world in which he's made them. That they are all, regardless of their status, whether they're kings or not, rich or poor, that they're equally endowed with this image. Now that's staggering in the world that it emerges in, but it's also really important for us because it's, in a sense, God begetting us. You know how sometimes that word comes up in the Bible. It is God giving us a sense of our origins and the fact that we, in our true sense, emerge from him. That is why we have that longing of the soul. That is why we have spiritual sensibilities. That is why we have an ethical composure to the way we go about our lives and ethical concerns about the way the world is run. That is why we're bothered that there's a hierarchy of individuals and some seem to rule over others and so on. Because we're made in the image of God. We're given some of that sensibility. We're certainly given that dignity and even that sense of power. He says that God, let us make them so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, and the implications for how we rule over the creation that God has given us, divested, if you like, some of his power and handed it over to us. This doesn't occur in any of the other literature around the Bible at the time. And this is where it starts. And this is where, if you like, God creates a community of people to know him, to be in his likeness. It's unthinkable that someone would create or bring someone forth and not want to know them. Or if they don't, then there's something really wrong. We all know what it is to have filial and familial bonds. And it's the most natural thing in the world if we have or know children, and that we will want them to represent us well, that we'll want to have a connection, a friendship, and a relationship with them. And if we don't, then we would say that that's kind of disordered. And this is the same thing. God has made people in his image so that they will be connected to him and also bear a resemblance to him. And this is important in terms of our identity and where we come from, because this is where everything starts. For all humanity, specifically if we're looking to think about how we are ordered as a people of God. Sometimes if I'm down on the mainland now, but because I'm from Lewis, if I run into other folks who have island connections. They'll say, whereabouts are you from? And I'll say, Lewis. And then they'll want to be much more specific. Yes, but which part? Because Lewis, like many other islands and any locale really, is divided up into different areas. You've got Nessept, and then you've got Point, which is out in the peninsula, and my part is from Lochs. And then if I say I'm from Lochs, and they're also from Lochs, they'll want to know specifically what villages my grandparents are from. And so it goes on, because that tells someone something about my identity, and it also gives us often a sense of shared connection, because we know the landmarks and we know the people that used to live in the houses and were on the crofts and so on. You and I come from God. At base, that is our core identity, and we were made to share that connection with him. But then, none of that is complete unless we're connected to each other. This is really interesting in Genesis chapter 2, because the Lord God takes the man, and then he put him in the garden, verse 15, in the Garden of Eden, to work it and to take care of it. So he gives him a job, if you like. The picture that we had is that God has made this sacred space, a place where his presence will be reflected and known. And it's mankind's job to take care of that, to look after it, to make sure this continues to be a space where God and his image is seen and his presence is able to be felt by people. And for Adam, in order to do this work, no suitable helper was found. So there's something missing. The livestock and all of that. God actually says in verse 18, it is not good for the man to be alone. It's the only thing in the whole of the creation that is said to be not good. And I think this is something we all instinctively know, that it's not good to be alone. In our society now, in the 21st century in the West, it's one of the most endemic problems that we have is loneliness, particularly among older folk, because a lot of the bonds and the ties of our communities that we naturally had have broken down. It's not good for us to be alone. So what does the Lord God do about this? So we've got the story that we all know well, where he puts the man to sleep, takes something from his side, and makes the woman, brings them together, hey presto. And normally, that's a great wedding passage, and it's often read at weddings, and it's often used as a kind of an apologetic for marriage and so on, which is fine. And I agree with that mostly, apart from what does that say to folks who aren't married, who either never could be married or don't get married, or they can't take part in this marriage and family and children thing for whatever reason. Are they destined to be alone, or is there some form of connection? And what I found interesting in studying the text this week is that this is about so much more than just people coming together in marriage. For one thing, the language that is used for Adam, and some of your translations will say rib. I much prefer the translation side, because the Hebrew term used is actually an architectural term. Whenever you look at the rest of the Old Testament, that word that is used of a kind of side support of a building, a really important part of a frame. It really just means one thing that supports another, and they're connected in that way. And the sleep that Adam goes into is sort of a dream. The word's used as a dream other places where something's revealed to someone. So it's almost like in this moment, God communicates to Adam what the purpose of being here is and what his connection is to be to other people around him. And the little poem that he sings, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman. How do you often describe folks who you feel like they're your kin and your people and they're really close to you? They're your own flesh and blood. In the rest of the Hebrew Bible, this is actually used as a familial term. The bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh is an idiom that often pops up to mean somebody's their closest people, those that are bonded to them, and ultimately their family. And what does all this mean for us? Well, it means that God is creating connection and community that is characterized by mutual dependence. Because see, where did this start? It started with Adam having the job of looking after this amazing creation that God has given him, and he doesn't have everything he needs to do that. Supposing he was Nikola Tesla or Elon Musk or whoever, the most brilliant self-made man that creation has ever seen, he would not have been able to fulfill the mandate he'd been given by God, because there's something built into the design of it where he needs somebody else. And there's something built into all of our design where we are mutually dependent and where we need each other, and we need that sense of community and working together. And we know this instinctively too, because you hopefully know what it is to be known by other folks and to be loved and appreciated for where you are, who you are, and that you belong within that group. And to have the mutual help and support of that group when you need it. You also, by contrast, might know what it is when that breaks down, when there are people that you should have a connection with, and yet there's an ache and a longing because you're not known or loved. You do not have the closeness, and you don't have the mutual support that you should be able to expect in that level of bond and connection. Because families are a mixed bag, and I always want to be careful to thread the needle on that. Some of us come from great families, and some of us come from families that didn't look anything like this. But the reason that we then feel that horrible ache and dysfunction is because it's not what we were made for or how we were made. We were made in such a way that we're mutually dependent on one another to caretake this amazing creation that we've got, with God's presence right at the center of it, so that more people will continue to be able to see that and take part of that. And when that breaks down, then we feel it. And so we're made for connection to God, but we're absolutely made for connection to one another. And the church can, and we'll think about this in later weeks, and should be a place where we're actually looking to chip away at restoring that if we can. Creating a place where folks actually know that we gather around the worship and the image of God, and we're connected to each other in that. We're united by a common gaze on Jesus Christ as he's revealed to us in the scriptures, but we're also united by this mutual dependence on one another and trying to fulfill the mandate that God has given us to lift each other up and to support one another and to belong in connection and community with one another. And we're also, lastly, connected to the place. Have you noticed how much work goes into the description of Eden? There's this garden in the east, and he made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. And of course, there's the famous 2 trees in the middle, but there's a river watering the garden from Eden, and there's the ultimate work of man to take care of all of this. This is why a sense of place is so important. And it's something that's often overlooked. Sometimes in church we give the impression that we're so obsessed with spirituality that we're only thinking of the next world and where you go when you die and how you can be a Christian and make sure that you get a good spot in heaven and all of that. And I caricature it, but quite often when folks outside the church ask me questions about what it's all about, that's the impression that they've been given, that that's what it's all about. And I want to try and untangle that a bit if I can, because the opening few chapters of our book talk about a good world and a land and a place that's hallowed, that people are connected to. Adam is made, or mankind is made from the earth. Yes, he's endowed with the very image of God from above, but he comes from the earth. And so he's inextricably connected to it. And that is why where this happens, our connection to God, but also our connection to each other, where that takes place is actually really important. There's the Apostle Paul in the New Testament in Acts. He's in the market square, in the equivalent of, Bridgewater shopping center square. And he's in that in Athens, and people are quizzing him and asking him, how do you know God is real, and what's he actually like, and what relationship does he have to the other gods, the Greek gods that we know? And he says this really curious phrase in Acts 17. He says, the God of heaven has determined the times and the places that we all should live. And so you are all here asking me that question for a purpose and for his determination, that you might be able to hear about him today. And that's something that's true for all of us. The place that God has set us and that we find ourselves is actually hugely important. The fact that we want to make buildings nice or beautify our gardens or homes in whichever way we can, or work to make our community a better place, are all instincts that come from these first few places. And so it's not as though our connection to God and connection to each other is just immaterial, and it can happen, in theory it can happen anywhere, but the Bible seems to say that it's important where that happens. And there's this sense of calling to place, to work wherever God has put us in order to make that better. Why? Not just for the sake of it. It's actually our sacred work, our sacred duty. Whatever you do to work to make your community, your home, your life and the life of those around you, your church, a better place, you're quite literally fulfilling the vocation which God has put us on earth for, because we were made to be connected to the places that we find ourselves, hopefully to find a love for them, but certainly to express the goodness and the gifts that God has put within us. And I can barely think of a better vision for the church and what it means to belong to the church today, and to belong hopefully to Erskine Parish Church, that it's somewhere where you can genuinely come and find that connection to God, to know that he is speaking to you and that he cares for you, but then also to find a group of people that care for you but are also connected to you in order to help you on that journey of connecting to God, and to work together in a shared mission, not just around worship, but also around community, where it's a place where the presence of God is so central, where we're trying to rediscover the purpose for which God has made us, to live in connection with him and love with one another, but also then to work to make the community and the space that we're in and the connections that we have in the place where we're set a recapitulation of God's original intention in Eden, where it's not paradise and it's not perfect, but it is fit for purpose. It's doing what it was designed to do, which is show people what God is like, what it means to belong, to be fully known and loved by others, and to have that sense of rootedness in a place where God continues to reveal himself to us. May God bless his word to us. Amen.